My husband sat across from me at our kitchen table on an ordinary Wednesday evening and said, "Margaret, there is something I need to tell you, and I am asking you, before I say it, to remember that I love you, and that everything I am about to say happened a very long time ago. I want you to understand something about my husband Harold, before I tell you what came next. We had been married for 46 years at that point. He was not a man given to dramatic statements or sudden confessions. He balanced our checkbook every month without fail. He had never once, in 46 years, raised his voice at me in anger. If you had asked anyone who knew us, our children, our neighbors, our church congregation, they would have told you that Harold and Margaret had one of the steadiest, most reliable marriages anyone in our small community had ever witnessed. So when he said those words, sitting across from me with his hands folded on our kitchen table, something in my chest went very cold, very quickly, in a way that 46 years of steady marriage had never prepared me to feel that I am 71 years old. My name is Margaret. What Harold told me that Wednesday evening, 3 months ago, did not simply surprise me. It rearranged, in the space of about 20 minutes, almost everything I believed I understood about the entire foundation of our shared life together. I am not going to keep you in suspense the way I had to sit in suspense myself, watching him gather the courage to actually say the words. I am going to tell you, across this story, exactly what he confessed, why he had carried it silently for as long as he had, and what has happened in the 3 months since between us. Because I think there is something important in this story, something about confession itself, about what it actually costs the person doing the confessing and the person receiving it, that I did not understand until I lived through it myself. I want to tell you what it feels like when the ground you have stood on for 46 years suddenly, quietly, shifts beneath your feet. Not through any single dramatic earthquake, but through one calm, measured confession, spoken across a kitchen table, by the most reliable man I have ever known. To understand the full weight of what Harold told me that evening, you need to understand the particular kind of marriage we had built across nearly 5 decades together, and the specific reasons his steadiness mattered so deeply to me. I met Harold in 1979, when I was 24 years old, working as a receptionist at a small accounting firm in our town. He was an associate at that same firm, quiet and unassuming, the kind of man who did not draw attention to himself but whose careful, reliable work was noticed and trusted by everyone who worked alongside him. We dated for just over a year before he proposed, and I said yes without much hesitation, drawn precisely to the qualities that would define our entire marriage. His stead, his consistency, his complete lack of the dramatic unpredictability that had characterized my own father's behavior throughout my childhood. That I want to explain that last point, because I believe it matters considerably to understanding why Harold's confession affected me as profoundly as it did. My own father struggled with alcohol throughout most of my childhood, and our household, as a result, carried a particular unpredictable tension that I spent my entire adult life trying to build a different kind of home away from. I married Harold, in significant part, because he represented the opposite of everything unstable and frightening about my own childhood home. He was predictable. He was steady. He never raised his voice, never came home unpredictable or volatile, never created the particular anxious uncertainty that had defined so much of my own early life. We built, across the following decades, exactly the kind of stable, reliable life I had always hoped for. Harold worked at that same accounting firm for 38 years, eventually becoming a partner, before retiring at 65 with a pension and savings that allowed us a comfortable, secure retirement. We raised 2 children together. Our son Richard, born in 1981, and our daughter Diane, born in 1984, in a household defined by consistency and calm, exactly the household I had spent my own childhood wishing for. Harold was not a particularly expressive man, not given to grand romantic gestures or effusive declarations of feeling, but he showed his love through unwavering reliability. He never missed a single school event for either of our children across their entire childhoods. He handled our finances with meticulous care that left us financially secure for our entire retirement. He was present, every single day, in the quiet, undramatic way that I had come to understand, across decades of marriage, as the truest expression of real devotion. That I want to be clear that I am not describing a perfect marriage, free of any ordinary friction or disagreement. Harold and I had our share of small conflicts across 46 years. Disagreements about finances, about how to handle various parenting decisions, about how to navigate the ordinary stresses that any long marriage accumulates. But beneath all of that ordinary friction, I always understood our marriage to be built on a foundation of complete, fundamental honesty. Harold was not a man who kept secrets. He was not a man capable, I believed, of the kind of significant deception that might require, decades later, a confession delivered across our kitchen table with the particular gravity he brought to that Wednesday evening conversation. This belief, that Harold was simply incapable of significant deception, was, I now understand, both genuinely true in most respects and profoundly, specifically incomplete in one particular area of his life that he had carried silently, hidden from me, across the entire span of our marriage. Our children grew up, built their own families, and by the time of Harold's confession 3 months ago, we had become grandparents to 5 grandchildren across Richard's and Diane's families. We had settled into the particular comfortable rhythm of a long, successful retirement, gardening, regular visits with our grandchildren, the steady, peaceful texture of a life well and carefully built across decades of mutual reliability. I want you to hold this picture clearly in your mind. The steady, reliable, fundamentally trustworthy marriage I am describing. Because it is essential to understanding exactly how profoundly disorienting it was when Harold finally, after 46 years, sat me down and told me the truth he had been carrying since long before we had even met. That I want to describe, carefully, the days immediately preceding Harold's confession, because looking back now, I recognize small signs I did not understand correctly at the time, signs that I believe were building toward the moment he finally found the courage to speak. About 2 weeks before that Wednesday evening, Harold had received a letter, an ordinary-looking envelope that he had opened at the kitchen table one afternoon, read quickly, and then folded carefully and placed in his shirt pocket without comment, in a manner that struck me, even in the moment, as slightly unusual for a man who typically shared the contents of any correspondence with me as a matter of routine habit. I asked him casually what the letter contained. He told me it was simply some old paperwork from his accounting firm, related to his pension, requiring no particular action on his part. I accepted this explanation without much further thought, given how thoroughly Harold's entire working life had been characterized by exactly this kind of routine administrative correspondence. Over the following 2 weeks, I noticed Harold becoming increasingly quiet, increasingly prone to staring out our kitchen window for long stretches in a manner that, again, struck me as slightly unusual, though not dramatically so. The kind of subtle change in mood that a wife of 46 years notices without necessarily feeling immediate alarm about. Given how many ordinary moods and preoccupations a long marriage naturally accommodates, that I asked him, on 3 or 4 separate occasions across those 2 weeks, whether something was troubling him. Each time he assured me he was fine, perhaps simply tired, perhaps thinking through some minor concern related to our finances or our home that did not yet require my involvement. I want to be honest that I did not press harder, in those 2 weeks, than I perhaps should have. I trusted, based on 46 years of established pattern, that whatever Harold was working through internally would eventually be shared with me once he had fully processed it himself, in his own characteristically measured way. This trust, I now understand, was both reasonable given our marriage's actual history, and also, in this particular instance, exactly the trust that allowed Harold the necessary space to finally work up the courage to share something considerably more significant than routine pension paperwork. On that Wednesday evening, Harold asked our daughter Diane, who had been visiting that week to help us with some household projects, if she would mind giving us some privacy for the evening, explaining that he needed to discuss something important with me alone. Diane, sensing the unusual gravity in her father's request, agreed without argument, though I noticed her glancing back at him with a particular concerned expression as she gathered her things to leave for the evening. Once Diane had departed, Harold made us both coffee, in a kind of careful, deliberate ritual that I recognize now as his way of gathering courage before what he clearly understood would be an extremely difficult conversation. We sat at our kitchen table, the same table where we had shared thousands of ordinary meals and conversations across 46 years, and he began speaking in the careful, measured tone I described at the beginning of this story. He told me that the letter he had received 2 weeks earlier was not, in fact, routine pension paperwork. It was correspondence from a woman named Patricia, a woman he had known briefly, many decades earlier, before he and I had ever met. I asked him, with a kind of cautious confusion rather than immediate alarm, why correspondence from a woman he had known before our marriage would require this particular level of gravity to discuss. Harold was quiet for a long moment. Then he told me that in 1977, 2 years before he and I met, he had been briefly involved with this woman, Patricia, during a period of his life he had never previously discussed with me in any detail. A period, he explained, when he had been working temporarily in a different city, away from our hometown, before returning to take the accounting position where I would eventually meet him. He told me that this relationship with Patricia had been brief, lasting only a few months, and had ended, by his account, amicably, before he had returned home and, shortly afterward, met me. I asked him, still not fully understanding the weight he was clearly building toward, why a brief, decades-old relationship that predated our entire marriage required this particular evening's serious conversation. Harold's hands, I noticed, had begun trembling slightly as he continued. He told me that Patricia's letter had informed him that she had given birth to a son in early 1978, several months after their relationship had ended, and that this son, now a man in his late 40s, was, according to Patricia's letter, Harold's biological child. I sat very still, absorbing this information, trying to understand its full implications before responding. Harold continued, his voice growing quieter, more difficult to maintain steadily. He told me that he had, in fact, known about this child for decades. Not from the very beginning, but Patricia had reached out to him once before, in 1985, 6 years into our own marriage, informing him directly of the child's existence and explaining that she had decided, at that time, to raise the boy independently, without seeking any financial support or ongoing involvement from Harold, given that he was, by that point, already married with a young family of his own. I asked Harold, my voice considerably less steady than I wanted it to be, whether this meant he had known about this child, my husband's biological son, conceived before our marriage but existing throughout almost the entire span of our marriage, for the past 41 years, without ever once telling me. He said yes. I need to describe as carefully and honestly as I can manage exactly what happened inside me as Harold continued explaining the full scope of what he had carried hidden for 41 years, because I believe this internal experience matters as much to this story as the facts themselves. I did not, in that initial moment, feel the explosive anger I might have expected from myself. Had someone asked me in advance how I would respond to learning my husband had hidden a child's existence for over 4 decades. Instead, I felt something more disorienting. A kind of vertiginous unsteadiness, as though the actual physical ground beneath our kitchen table had shifted slightly, requiring me to recalibrate my basic sense of balance before I could even begin processing the emotional content of what he was telling me. I asked him, once I had gathered enough composure to speak, why he had made the choice, in 1985, to keep this information from me, rather than telling me directly when Patricia had first reached out to confirm the child's existence and her decision to raise him independently. Harold's answer to this question, I believe, represents the true emotional core of this entire story. He said, Margaret, I was terrified in 1985 of what telling you would do to everything we had built. We had Richard, who was 4 years old at that point, and Diane was just a baby. I had convinced myself in the moment that telling you about a child from before our marriage, a child Patricia had explicitly decided to raise without my involvement, would only introduce unnecessary pain and complication into a marriage and a young family I was working so hard to build steadily and securely. I told myself I was protecting you, protecting our young family, by keeping this information contained to myself alone. I asked him whether he had ever had any contact with this child, his biological son. Across the decades since he told me he had not, beyond a single brief exchange of letters around the time the boy turned 18, in 1996, when Patricia had apparently encouraged her son to reach out directly if he wished, offering him the choice of whether to pursue any relationship with his biological father. Harold told me that he had responded to that initial letter carefully, expressing willingness to meet if the young man wished, but that the correspondence had ended after only 2 exchanges, with the son ultimately deciding, at that time, not to pursue further contact. I asked Harold why, even after that point. After our own children were grown, after the original protective justification he had offered for his 1985 silence had presumably become less relevant, he had continued keeping this entire history hidden from me for an additional 29 years. He was quiet for a long moment before answering. Then he said something that I believe reveals an uncomfortable but important truth about how secrets, once established, develop their own persistent momentum entirely separate from their original justification. He said, "Margaret, I think if I'm honest with myself, the original reason I told myself in 1985 stopped being the real reason fairly quickly. I think the real reason became, simply, that the longer I kept this hidden, the more impossible telling you felt. Every year that passed made the eventual confession feel like a bigger betrayal. Not because the original facts had changed, but because the accumulated weight of having hidden them for so long made the silence itself feel like the greater sin, the one I was most afraid of you discovering and judging me for." I asked him, then, what had finally prompted him to break that silence now, after 41 years, rather than continuing to carry it indefinitely, as he apparently had been prepared to do for decades. He told me that the letter he had received 2 weeks earlier was from Patricia herself, now in her late 60s, informing him that she had recently been diagnosed with a serious illness, and that she wanted, before whatever time she had remaining ran out, to encourage both Harold and their son to consider, once more, whether they might want to build some kind of relationship, however limited, while there was still time to do so. She had written, according to Harold, that she no longer felt any reason to maintain her own decades-old insistence on keeping Harold and their son's lives separate, given her own changed circumstances, and her desire to see whatever reconciliation might still be possible occur, while she remained alive to witness at least the beginning of it. Harold told me he had spent 2 weeks wrestling with how to respond to this letter, eventually concluding that he could not consider any renewed contact with his biological son without first telling me the full truth he had carried hidden for over 4 decades. I sat with all of this, that Wednesday evening, trying to absorb not simply the facts themselves, but their full implications for understanding the entire shape of the marriage I believed I had been living inside for 46 years. I asked him, finally, the question that I believe mattered most to me in that initial moment of disorientation. Did this mean our entire marriage, the steady, trustworthy foundation I had built my whole adult life upon, had actually been resting on this same kind of significant, sustained deception the whole time, hidden beneath the surface of everything I believed I understood about him? Harold's answer to this question, delivered with what I recognized, even in my own distress, as genuine and considerable pain of his own, was the thing that ultimately allowed me to begin processing everything more fully in the weeks that followed. He said, "Margaret, I understand if this changes how you see our entire marriage. I understand if you need to question everything now, including things that have nothing to do with this specific secret. But I want you to know, as clearly as I can say it, that this is the only significant thing I have ever kept from you across our entire 46 years together. I have made many ordinary mistakes, the kind every marriage accumulates, but I have never had another secret of this magnitude, before or since. I am not asking you to simply accept that claim on faith. I am telling you because I think you deserve to know exactly what you are dealing with, rather than being left to wonder if there might be other equally significant things still hidden beneath the surface." I want to tell you honestly that the weeks immediately following Harold's confession were among the most difficult of our entire marriage. Difficult in a way that required both of us to work through genuinely complicated, layered emotions rather than arriving quickly at any simple resolution. I moved into our guest bedroom for the first 10 days after his confession, needing physical space to process what I had learned without the immediate, constant presence of the man whose 46 years of presumed complete honesty I was now having to reconsider entirely. Harold respected this need for space without argument, continuing to show up for our ordinary daily responsibilities, managing our finances, maintaining our home, while giving me the room I needed to work through my own complicated reaction. I told our children, Richard and Diane, what their father had confessed, feeling that they deserved to understand why their parents' previously steady marriage had suddenly become visibly strained. Their reactions, predictably, were complicated and varied. Richard, more like his father in temperament, processed the news with careful, measured questions, working methodically through the practical and emotional implications. Diane reacted with more immediate emotional intensity, including real anger toward her father that took several weeks of difficult conversation to begin working through. That I want to describe a particular conversation I had with Diane during this period, because I believe it helped me understand something important about my own eventual path toward processing everything that had happened. Diane said to me, during one particularly difficult phone call about 2 weeks after Harold's confession, "Mom, how can you even consider staying with him after this? He lied to you for 41 years. That's not a small thing. That's basically your entire marriage." I told her that I understood her anger, and that I was still working through considerable anger and hurt of my own. But I told her something else as well, something I had been working toward understanding across those difficult first weeks of processing. I said, "Diane, I think there's a difference between a marriage built on an ongoing pattern of significant deception and a marriage where one specific, contained secret existed alongside genuine, sustained honesty in every other significant respect. I am still working through how I feel about the specific thing your father hid. But I do not believe, when I look honestly at our entire 46 years together, that this single secret, as significant as it is, actually changes the fundamental reality of how reliably and honestly your father showed up for me and for our family in essentially every other respect across all those decades." I want to be honest that arriving at this understanding took considerable time and required several extended conversations with Harold himself, conversations in which I asked him to walk through, in detail, the specific reasoning and emotional experience behind his original 1985 decision and his subsequent decades of continued silence. What helped me most, ultimately, was Harold's own willingness to sit with my anger and my questions without becoming defensive, without minimizing the legitimate hurt his decades of silence had caused, without rushing me toward forgiveness before I had genuinely worked through my own complicated feelings. About 6 weeks after his initial confession, I asked Harold whether he wanted to pursue contact with his biological son, now that the truth was finally out between us. He told me he did want to, but that he wanted my genuine support and involvement in that process, rather than pursuing it separately or secretly in any way, understanding clearly, by this point, exactly how much damage decades of separated, hidden information had already caused. We reached out together about 2 months after Harold's original confession, to his biological son, a man named Stephen, now 47 years old, living about 3 hours from us with his own wife and 2 teenage children. Stephen was, understandably, cautious and uncertain about renewed contact, given the limited and ultimately unsuccessful nature of their previous brief correspondence decades earlier. We arranged, eventually, a careful, tentative first meeting. Myself, Harold, and Stephen, meeting at a quiet restaurant roughly halfway between our 2 homes, a meeting that I want to describe honestly as cautious and somewhat awkward. Now, 3 months after Harold's original confession, I do not have a perfectly resolved, neatly tied conclusion to offer you. Harold and I have found our way back to a genuine, steady closeness, though I want to be honest that the specific quality of trust between us has shifted in ways I am still learning to understand. I no longer believe, the way I once did without any conscious thought, that Harold is simply incapable of significant deception. I now understand, more completely, that he is a man capable of carrying a difficult truth in protective, well-intentioned silence for decades, even as he remained, in every other observable respect, the steady, reliable partner I had always believed him to be. This more complicated understanding has not destroyed our marriage, but it has changed it, in a way I am still working to fully articulate even to myself. I believe, now, that even the most fundamentally trustworthy people are capable of carrying specific, isolated secrets, particularly secrets born from fear and protective instinct rather than malicious deception. I do not believe this makes Harold a fundamentally dishonest man. But I no longer believe in the kind of absolute, uncomplicated transparency I once assumed defined our entire marriage, and I am learning to hold a more nuanced, perhaps more realistic understanding of what genuine trust between 2 people, even after 46 years, actually requires and can reasonably promise. Harold and Stephen's relationship continues to develop slowly, carefully, with no guarantee of how close they might eventually become. Given the genuine challenge of building any meaningful connection across 47 years of near-total separation. Patricia's health, as of this telling, remains stable for now, though uncertain in its longer trajectory, and I believe she has found some real peace in seeing Harold and Stephen take these first careful steps toward whatever relationship might still be possible to build, even at this late stage of all our lives. If you are someone currently carrying a significant secret from someone you love, born originally from fear or a genuine desire to protect them, I want to offer you something I have learned through living inside this particular difficult disruption to my own 46-year marriage. The longer a protective secret continues, the more its continuation becomes about your own fear of the eventual reckoning, rather than about genuinely protecting the person you originally meant to shield. I believe Harold's original 1985 reasoning, however imperfect, came from genuine protective love. I believe his subsequent decades of continued silence, however, gradually became more about his own accumulated fear of confession than about any continued protective necessity, that I do not know, even now, exactly how I would have wanted Harold to handle this difficult information, had I been the one facing his original choice in 1985. I understand, with more complexity than I once did, how genuinely difficult that choice must have been for him, weighing his fear of disrupting our young family against the slowly accumulating weight of an ever-growing deception. What I know now, having lived through the difficult 3 months since his eventual confession, is this. However painful and disorienting an honest confession proves to be, however much ground it shifts beneath your feet, it remains, in the end, a sturdier foundation to eventually rebuild upon than the comfortable, familiar ground of continued secrecy, however stable that secrecy might feel while it lasts. The ground beneath me shifted significantly, 3 months ago, across an ordinary Wednesday evening conversation at our kitchen table. I am still, in many ways, finding my new footing. But I believe, with real if cautious hope, that the footing I am gradually rebuilding, founded now on complete honesty rather than well-intentioned partial concealment, will ultimately prove more genuinely steady than the comfortable, incomplete stability I unknowingly stood upon for the 41 years before Harold finally found the courage to tell me the truth.